welcome people. I'm going to start by acknowledging that the land we're on wasn't always ours. So Bill, would you like to give our land acknowledgement? Thank you.
Okay. We'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land we stand upon is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Neutral, and Wendat peoples. Oral and archaeological records indicate that the Haudenosaunee, or people of the Longhouse, have been occupants of southwestern Ontario for over 13,000 years. This territory was subject to the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum, signed between Indigenous nations in 1701, and was also subject to the Upper Canada Treaties in the later 18th and early 19th centuries. We respect the long-standing relationship that Indigenous nations have to this land. This territory continues to be the home to diverse Indigenous peoples, whom we recognize as the original caretakers and its contemporary stewards. The dish, or as it's sometimes called, the bowl of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, represented what now is southern Ontario, from the Great Lakes to Quebec, and from Lake Simcoe to the United States. This treaty acknowledged the shared responsibility of ensuring the dish would never empty, which included taking care of the land and the animals who inhabited it. Importantly, spoons were brought to the treaty table, not weapons, as a representation of keeping the peace. The wampum referenced is an intricately decorated belt which symbolized the agreement, in effect, a record of the diplomatic agreement to ensure that memory of the agreement would be preserved. The wampum is mostly made of white whelk shells with an area of purple quahog clam shells at the center, representing the dish, and it currently resides at the Royal Ontario Museum. One of the core values of the Dish with One Spoon is that those who use the land should not abuse the land. In other words, individuals and groups should only take what they need from the land so that there will be healthy, long-term, sustainable environment. We look to the wisdom of the Indigenous peoples to assist us in the care and management of our earth, water, and air for future generations. We wish to express our support for the implementation of the 94 calls to action in the recommendations of the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and we welcome the introduction of Bill C-15 legislation in Canada to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. These are important steps towards healing and justice, and environmental and social justice are closely intertwined. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. Welcome everybody to our, I don't know if this is 4th, 5th, 6th in a series of webinars co-hosted by the City of Stratford's Energy and Environment Committee in collaboration with Climate Momentum. For those of you who would like to know, Climate Momentum is a community-based climate action group in Stratford and Perth County, and their vision is for a community engaged in creative, bold responses to the global climate crisis and committed to a carbon neutral Perth County by 2040. In addition, it's co-hosted by the City of Stratford's Energy and Environment Advisory Committee, which is made up of Emily Skelding, Anna Stratton, Councillor Burbach, Councillor Henderson, Mike Jorna, Sammy Orr, Jeff Crowder, Anita Jacobson, Vani Azano, and the contents of this webinar will be available as a recording both at the Climate Momentum website, climatemomentum.ca, and at stratford.ca. I also want to welcome, you'll see their faces on the beginning here, Emily, who is a member of the Energy and Environment Committee, and Jeff Crowder, a member of the Energy and Environment Committee, who will be tasked with asking Eric your questions when those questions come up, or with questions, and I'll also be asking questions. In addition, this setup is being broadcast in two ways. One, direct on this Zoom portal, and at the bottom of your screen, if you're on a computer, you'll see a Q&A tab. If you're on a phone, it might be on the side, it might be on the top. But if you want to ask questions and have the opportunity to direct them to me, Mike Sullivan. I'm your host, and I'm also on the Energy and Environment Committee. And we will take those questions and turn around and give them to our lovely guest, Mr. Eric Miller. And so now I'd like to introduce to you Mr. Eric Miller. He is a professor at York University, but he is an economist and educator focused on sustainability metrics and models and policy. He's a David Suzuki Fellow focused on enhancing ecological economic literacy in Canada, and that's the purpose of tonight's Zoom webinar. He also teaches courses, he taught me, in ecological economics and sustainability informatics, and directs many projects and partnerships at York University, including the production of the National Ecological Footprint and Biocapacity Accounts. Eric's prior work as a consulting economist has informed governments, industry, think tanks, and NGOs. Eric's earlier career in public service had him leading the team of economists in the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources after he had worked for the Ministry of Environment and Environment Canada. So unless I've forgotten to introduce anybody, I'm ready to hand this meeting off to Mr. Miller. As I said before, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A and I will compile them. If you have questions on Facebook, write your questions on Facebook and they'll be sent to me to be compiled, to be delivered, as many as we can, to Professor Miller at the end of his presentation. So without further ado, I welcome you to Eric Miller.
Great, thanks so much, Mike, and thanks everyone for inviting me. Thanks everyone for tuning in. So it's my pleasure to help empower you with a bit more economic literacy on the topic of ecological economics for a carbon neutral economy. I will cover some concepts you might have heard of or you might not have heard of, but are worth engaging with. And again, it's my hope that at the end of this presentation and the questions and discussions that we'll have afterwards, that you'll feel more empowered to be able to engage in broad societal conversations about the path to a carbon neutral economy and the economics in the service of that as well. Mike, if you could just mute yourself, Mike, because I'm getting a bit of feedback from you there. That'd be great. All right, wonderful. So start off by this. I'm going to cover a few sort of big topics that might be a little bit broad and sort of new to you, but I'll start off with something that maybe is a bit more familiar to you, and that is certainly familiar to me in my neighborhood where I live in downtown Hamilton. I have a lot of convenience stores around me. I've got 4 convenience stores within a few blocks radius, and these convenience stores now are abuzz with activity in the realm of slushies being sold. Now, what I find interesting about this is that all these convenience stores have these machines that keep whizzing all year round. And it's always sort of intrigued me and somewhat bothered me too, as to why these things would be continuing to work sort of year round, when really there's only an active slushy season from essentially May to September or so. And I did engage with one of the proprietors of the convenience stores about this. I'm asking rather innocently, by the way, how many slushies do you sell after October? And that was met with great laughter, saying, well, of course, we don't sell any slushies then. But you know, it sort of picks up in May and so on. And now, of course, the economist within me then asked him the obvious question, which is, are you sure that it's worth keeping these things going year round, even though you're not, you know, no one's you know, consuming the products of these? To which I was met with great laughter and saying, well, I don't know, but if you stop the machines, then you have to clean them, and then there's this, there's a bit of fuss involved in that, and sort of, so just keep them going all year round. Now, of course, that revealed to me a few obvious points. One is, I wonder then how sort of clean the content is of these slushy machines if they're working all year round, year after year, without being cleaned and so on. But then secondly, too, I was just curious, I wonder how much energy these things use and so on. I think this is a useful way to start thinking about anchoring this sort of broad concept of the path to a carbon neutral economy, because if we expand beyond this very concrete sort of example to broader examples within society and within the economy, there are, of course, a lot of unknowns and a lot of potential for discovery through, in this case, maybe measuring energy use and questioning some things that we take as conventional wisdom, that you just keep these things running all year round and so on. And there's a great role for economics in all of this to help sort of bridge the gap between the sort of micro and very specific to sort of the macro, towards the sort of system level engagement of people with information, with prices, with trade-offs, with decisions, with plans, with equipment like this that's durable, and so on. And so that way, perhaps then thinking more broadly in the future, when we have weather such as this, which is from more of the year here in Hamilton than the current weather we're having now, might lead us to sort of think differently about not just these small machines, but also broader things as well. And so just like with slushies and other beverages, there are lots of choices when it comes to the types of economics and economists that you might want to engage in asking these sort of big questions, challenging conventional wisdom of trying to uncover and discover information, metrics that will help to inform us about what better ways of doing things into the future. And so in that realm, I'm sure you're very well equipped to be able to engage with competing choices of products in the supermarket and so on, but there's also competing sort of brands of economics as well. And so it's important to be mindful of this, because different brands of economics engage with different topics in different ways. And just like in the same way that you have probably preferences when it comes to products and services and so on, based on like the labels and the attributes and so on, I would suggest that you probably want to discover that you might have preferences for certain types of economics more so than others. And so I'll start off by focusing just on this concept of economics called ecological economics. And so ecological economics is a brand of economics that was formalized just a few decades ago, so it's relatively young, but it's a brand of economics that aims to transform the economy and economic thinking and so on to make it much more future-friendly than conventional economics. There's various ways to characterize ecological economics as compared to others. One is that it has a central focus on sustainability. Now, there's various ways to define sustainability, but one of the ways to define it is essentially sustainability is the stewardship of all the things that are durable that we want to last. And so we might call those things like human capital, built capital, natural capital, lands and waters, and that sort of thing. And key part of sustainability also involves understanding our metabolic relations to the lands and waters that sustain us. Because after all, we can't produce something from nothing, nor can we produce nothing from something. All the things that we produce are actually transformed from nature using lands and waters and the energy around us. And so that's why it's really important to be mindful of sustainability. And so that's one of the key areas of focus of ecological economics. Ecological economists and ecological economics is also interested in efficiency as well. And so efficiency, there's various ways to define this, but essentially efficiency is about getting the most from using the least. And we're also interested in the economic concept of distribution and ways of measuring it and so on. And that, of course, relates to understanding who has, who gives, who gets, and so on. And it's important to be mindful of all these three aspects at the same time, because it's not automatic that success in one of these domains leads to success in the others. And so that's why, as ecological economists, when we're faced with some kind of a challenge we're trying to understand and resolve, we like to think about these three dimensions concurrently. And so that's what I'd like to do here for you in the realm of the economics of the path to a carbon neutral economy. So in this realm then, with regards to sustainability, I want to focus on the accounting needed for net zero emissions. And in the realm of efficiency, I'll speak to how to efficiently get to net zero. And then in the realm of distribution, I'll talk about the future burdens of today's greenhouse gas emissions. I'm not going to speak too much about the natural science aspect of all this. I'll presume that you have a good sense of that, but I'm going to speak about the economics, the future burdens of today's greenhouse gas emissions. And so on that, I'll start off with a concept that you may or may not have heard about, and that is called the social cost of carbon. Some have said that this is the potentially the most important number that most people will have never heard about. And so this idea of the social cost of carbon is an attempt to estimate the value of future damages net of benefits from emitting 1 more ton of carbon dioxide today or any other greenhouse gas today. Now, to get to this, there's quite an interesting and elaborate exercise that economists do. And so what we do is we take the climate models, the best climate models that exist on the planet, and work off the results from those that help us to understand what the climate in the future is likely to look like, given current trends, patterns, and that sort of thing in certain scenarios. And then apply that future climate to future economy and its people and the production of food and energy, material goods and services, and so on. And when we apply that, then we're able to quantify the damages from higher carbon emissions from climate change in the future. We can also quantify any benefits from a warmer climate. And so there are regionally some benefits and some realms and so on. And then we piece all that information together, so damages and the benefits in those time periods in the future. And then we value those damages and benefits in monetary units in the future. And then we transform those into present values to arrive at the present value of the future damages from emitting 1 more ton of greenhouse gas emissions today. So that's quite an exercise. I hope you can appreciate that there's a lot of work, but also a lot of uncertainties going into there, a lot of assumptions that we make in those models, and the consequences, and the sort of transferring of values over time and so on. From this, we find, of course, not surprisingly, that the social cost of carbon rises over time with rising emissions, since damages grow with accumulated emissions. After all, the problem of climate change is the result of the accumulated amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Every year's worth of emissions add to that because we're already in excess of the threshold by which the lands and waters can assimilate those emissions. And so with this concept of the social cost of carbon, we can actually arrive at a number and a range of numbers that can be very informative for us today. So today, the social cost of carbon is between about 140 and 450 Canadian dollars per ton of emissions. Depending on assumptions and the models of use that account for the range there that's present. And so this is kind of interesting, and this is also potentially, to many of you, quite shocking as well, that the damages net of the benefits are indeed quite high. And so this does confirm that economically, with a lot of what we're contemplating doing nowadays to try to reduce emissions to get us on that path to net zero by 2050 involves a lot of work, involves a lot of effort. But even with all that work and effort, we're finding that the cost per ton avoided is certainly not even, or shouldn't be necessarily even this expensive. So this metric of the social cost of carbon can be quite useful to kind of characterize some sense of what those damages are. Because still today, it's not apparent, I think, to a lot of people that economically there is quite a significant cost to each additional emission today on the future of humanity. Now, for all of you at a municipal level, it would probably be helpful if the federal and provincial governments provided some guidance to you on the social cost of carbon, because with numbers like this, then it can help you when you're arriving at certain decisions and plans and strategies and so on for the future. It's really helpful to have some sense of the social cost of carbon to be able to put that number in to your appraisals of projects, trade-offs, and that sort of thing, so that you can be informed as to whether it is more versus less economic to pursue a certain pathway and strategy for the future, and so on. Now, on the social cost of carbon, it's important to note that this can be juxtaposed against the carbon price in a jurisdiction, because not all jurisdictions have a price on carbon or a carbon price at the moment. The social cost of carbon confirms that we must act to reduce our emissions, and we can use carbon pricing to achieve emission reductions. Damages will happen with each amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we release today, whether or not we're paying for it through, let's say, a carbon tax or a cap and trade system, which I'll speak to shortly. And so carbon price can be used to reach a climate target, and the price may not be at that social cost of carbon, but we would expect it over time to approach that level. So with this, I think it's important to reflect on the concept of carbon pricing, because you probably heard about this, and you probably do wonder why this expression of carbon pricing is used as opposed to, let's say, carbon taxing or something to that effect. And so I'd like to help you make sense of this in a way of saying that carbon pricing is a term, an umbrella term used for a few different strategies of pricing carbon. Now, there's one very direct way, and that is to, in comparison with an indirect way, directly you can set a price on emissions to affect the quantity of emissions. So that's one form of carbon pricing, and that's where you get into the realm, let's say, of a carbon tax. That's setting a price on each unit of emissions, and the purpose of doing that is to affect the quantity of emissions, and to have it so that, in a broad sense, throughout the market economy and so on, that people's decisions are being informed by a price on that pollution. The indirect way of going about carbon pricing is to set a cap on the quantity of emissions to affect the price of emissions. And so that's where you get examples like the cap and trade system in Quebec, or the former Ontario system that existed from 2017 to 2018. And that's a system where we set a cap on the total quantity of emissions, and then all those that emit within that cap have a share of emissions, and they can buy or sell their share depending upon whether it's more advantageous to them to reduce their emissions even more than they need to and sell the savings to others who are finding it harder to reduce their emissions at the same rate that other leaders are. And the logic of that system is that it allows, within that community of emitters or polluters, they can sort out amongst themselves as to who is reducing more versus less pollution, as long as the total sums up to that cap. So the distinction between these two is that with a direct carbon pricing, you have more certainty about the price, but less certainty about the quantity of emissions, because the quantity of emissions will be affected by the price, but not so directly. Whereas in this indirect approach, then you have much more certainty on the quantity of emissions, but less certainty about the price of emissions. In both of these cases, though, we find the result that this makes the prices of goods and services more inclusive of their emissions. And the great thing about this too is that it incentivizes ongoing conservation by producers and consumers and investors. After all, producers have ongoing incentives to conserve emissions, because by doing so, they save a cost. Same thing with consumers, and same thing with investors, who are increasingly asking questions about exposure to carbon risks and so on. And those are increasingly being put into financial reporting, metrics, and so on. Now, across the world, there's a good mix of systems of direct and indirect approaches to carbon pricing. Here's a plot of systems that have been inventoried by the World Bank. And I've got in the blue dots representing jurisdictions that directly price carbon through a tax or a levy. And then the orange dots there, I've got the jurisdictions that price emissions from a trading system. And I've got it plotted in a two-dimensional space here. So we've got the percent coverage along the x-axis in the bottom. And so anything above 50% here means that more than 50% of the emissions within that particular jurisdiction are covered by that particular price or trading system. And then we've got the carbon price in Canadian dollars on the y-axis here. I'll just show you the names of these jurisdictions so you get a sense. Sweden and Finland were some of the earlier adopters of carbon pricing back in the 1990s. Theirs has the highest carbon price per ton, but are certainly not the most broadly covering, not the most comprehensive. Amongst the most comprehensive, actually, this is dot here, which is shared both by Quebec and by California. Their emissions trading system captures about 85% of the emissions in that jurisdiction, so it's quite comprehensive. And we'd say as economists that generally speaking, we would like to see this evolution towards a growing coverage of emissions by that particular system. And then also that pathway to having the carbon price per ton get much closer to the social cost of carbon, so that we can bring about a much more efficient economy that is much more efficient in its use of resources, energy, materials, and so on. So with all of this considered, I also want to show you a plot then of the share of the annual global greenhouse gas emissions covered by the pricing systems, whether it's quantity or a cap and trade system or a sort of a tax-based system. And so this over time, you can see that in the 1990s, there weren't many jurisdictions that had a carbon pricing system. But then starting in the year 2000s, you have more and more jurisdictions and more coverage. A big bump up came when the European Union had their emissions trading system emerge in the early 2000s. And then, especially in the last 10 years, there's been more and more jurisdictions coming on with a carbon pricing system. What's really interesting here in 2021, this year, is that we'll see China's national emissions trading system come online. And when it comes online, that emissions trading system is going to account for a very large portion of the annual greenhouse gas emissions, so much so that it's going to cover more than any single system, other single system in the world up to that point. When we start seeing this happening, and expect this to grow quite a bit over time, ultimately we want to have broader coverage worldwide, so we ideally want all jurisdictions to have some kind of a carbon pricing system, especially when it comes to trade and so on. It's really important to have that sort of broad coverage. But I think it's really meaningful that, that China's emissions trading system is coming online this year. So with all this considered then, not surprisingly, when you engage in carbon pricing, you start to see a lot of transformations happening gradually as the price becomes more adequate and closer to the social cost of carbon, and also as the system becomes more comprehensive in its coverage. And so you're probably mindful of all kinds of interesting examples that you're starting to see. Certainly from a municipal focus, a lot of interest in electrifying transportation systems. We're looking at interest in having, let's say, biofuels as an interim measure on the path towards much more electrification of transportation systems and even transit systems too at a municipal level. We've got interest in engaging with energy systems, including even natural gas systems. I was just reviewing a few months ago a proposal to use the sort of surplus electricity from the Ontario grid that's not being used in a moment in time to actually use that to electrolyze water to generate hydrogen gas, and to actually inject the hydrogen gas into the natural gas distribution system, which can be done up to certain thresholds without having to change, furnaces and equipment and that sort of thing. It would be most efficient to do that for the industrial users rather than the broad-based user group, but certainly that is also a possibility too. And what's neat about this kind of innovation and all these kind of innovations is that when we engage in carbon pricing, it allows the people who manage these systems to have a better handle on what's within the realm of possibilities in the future. And once carbon is priced, then it helps to make business cases for doing something differently that's going to economize on carbon emissions. Because after all, if there's no price to them, you can't generate the savings from them. We see other examples, of course, a lot of interest in retrofit programs too, although key questions about how to set those things up right so that the most efficient. Interest in sort of green concrete to green materials, and so on, which I'm sure will be a great interest municipally, given I'm sure a lot of consumption of concrete at a municipal level with municipal infrastructure and so on. There's a lot of interest, of course, in changing the way that food is grown, that land is cultivated. You've probably heard about differences in tilling technologies, different in rotations and so on. And of course, with carbon pricing, certainly that also brings online all kinds of other interests in, let's say, reducing leaks within systems, especially natural gas distribution systems, where you really don't want to have natural gas leaking, because natural gas is quite a potent greenhouse gas, especially when it's not burnt and it resides around in the atmosphere for quite a long time as methane. So with all these ideas, carbon pricing needs to be adequate, comprehensive in coverage, and lasting for us to get the most uptake, and to help everybody in society at all levels, in all jurisdictions, big and small, households, individuals, businesses, communities, neighborhoods, and everyone else to better make use of the information about carbon savings and how to transform the way that they do things, and start thinking about great opportunities that weren't apparent to them before, or weren't economic to them before, because carbon wasn't priced. We're also hearing a lot about nature-based solutions, and that's really key to getting towards net zero these days. And so the idea here is that the reason why jurisdictions are signing on to this idea of net zero emissions by a certain date in the future is that the net refers to the gross amount of emissions minus the sequestration of emissions in that same time period. And so you can end up with getting towards net emissions, even if you still have gross emissions. And the logic there is that, of course, there's lots of nature-based solutions to soak up carbon from the atmosphere. And if you can soak up carbon from the atmosphere, even as carbon is being put into the atmosphere by humans, that's one way to reduce net emissions. And now there's a lot of nature-based solutions being talked about. The one that almost sort of everyone volunteers, because it's almost like, I think, inherent to a lot of people that it must be a useful nature-based solutions, is this idea to plant more trees, to afforest lands that currently aren't forested. A lot of interest in this across all sectors. But of course, when we think about this, we have to be mindful that if we're going to afforest lands, that means that the lands aren't available for other uses too. And so that does become a bit of a juxtaposition against some other nature-based solutions, including, for example, using lands to generate biofuels as a substitution for fossil fuels, which can be net zero somewhat, depending on the accounting over the course of a certain cycle. If you're burning biomass, that's very different than burning fossil fuels, because if you burn biomass, that's not a net addition to the carbon sort of on the surface of the planet. But if you burn fossil fuels, there is, obviously. Then again, if we're going to generate more biofuels from the lands, whether it's ethanol, or whether we're going to, let's say, have I don't know, solar panels across fields and so on, those of course come as trade-offs. So we can't also be doing that and afforesting at the same time. We have to be mindful, of course, that we're still interested, of course, in using lands and waters for food. And of course, a great amount of the lands, especially in Southern Ontario, is also currently sort of occupied by built up infrastructure and so on. And at the same time, too, there's a lot of interest in switching to more renewable materials, let's say, using more wood in construction rather than steel and aluminum, to have timber frame buildings that are even taller than they used to be before, based on new sort of engineered wood sort of materials and design and that sort of thing. But of course, when we think about all of these things together, we should be apparent that, of course, all of this is competing for the similar amounts of land. And that's really important, I think, for Southern Ontario, because Southern Ontario has very biologically productive lands and waters. And so there's obviously quite a deal of competition amongst these competing nature-based solutions for the land. And so, is it land to feed us as humans or to feed animals that we eat as humans? Is it to grow biofuels? Is it to not to be cultivated, but actually to be afforested and left to soak up emissions? Is it to be used for generating bioproducts in lieu of mineral products and so on that aren't regenerative and aren't renewable and so on? All of this calls for the need for an area-based accounting of possibilities and trade-offs. And I hope you'll agree with me that that is certainly something that we need. And just reflecting that one of your hosts for this evening, Mike Sullivan, wrote a great article, I think it was a few months, that he shared with me, where he did a little bit of number crunching around some of the afforestation, the tree planting proposals being talked about at the federal level, the 2 billion trees program, and started asking some obvious questions about, well, where are those going to be? Is this land that otherwise would be producing food, or is this newly vacant land, or what are all these sort of questions that need to be answered, and so on. And we need to be much more attentive like that to understanding the competition for land amongst these various technologies and so on. So that's where I would just say, like, a key message I'd like to offer you, and I'd like to encourage you to offer everyone else too, is essentially that when it comes to the path to net zero or a carbon neutral economy, we really need to focus on do the math. If we want to come up with sort of a political chant or slogan or something whenever someone is talking about either planting more trees or increasing the ethanol content in gasoline in Ontario or something to that effect, we should always ask the question of, okay, well, how does that fit in to an overall carbon budget, let's say? In other words, let's do the math on this. Let's figure this out empirically. And certainly that's something I would encourage you to challenge others to do, or to try to do yourself. You can even do a little bit of almost what we would call back of the envelope, a little bit of arithmetic to try to figure out the possibilities and constraints and so on. And so that's where you might hear about people talking about a carbon budget. And when they talk about a carbon budget, they're talking about essentially doing the math on all the things that we're thinking of on the pathway to net zero emissions. We want to quantify what those actions are, where they're going to take place on the landscape, when they're going to come online, what the emissions are that they're going to reduce or soak up or sequester if they're a nature-based solution, or what the emissions, the savings of emissions are going to be if they're improved technologies and that sort of thing, and put it all together and crunch the numbers to arrive at the path to net zero. Because if we don't do that, there's no guarantee that when we sort of dream up all these sort of ideas intuitively, that it necessarily gets to where we want to go, which is actually a very empirically specific spot, which is net zero emissions. We should also, of course, be doing spatial analysis, because all of our uses of lands and waters and so on, of course, happen somewhere on this planet. And so it's important to be mindful of where that happens. And that's where I think spatial analysis comes in. So on that note, I'd like to profile one aspect of sort of doing some math in the realm of spatial analysis that I think is really useful for all of us, and certainly could be for some of your own projects or things that you're thinking about there at either a local level or at a more provincial level or even at a global level and so on. And that is where we engage in ecological footprint and biocapacity accounting. So I'd like to profile this to you, because I think it's very useful, and it should be something that's on our minds as we're thinking about pathways to net zero emissions. And so the ecological footprint is a measure of the lands and waters that are needed to supply us as humans with a generated flow of goods and services that we consume within the course of a year. There's various ways to characterize that. One simple way is essentially the ecological footprint is a measure of humanity's demand for carrying capacity. If you have a natural science background, you're familiar with the concept of carrying capacity, which is the ability of lands and waters to carry a certain organism, to sustain it with materials and energy flows and so on. And so in this sense, this is sort of the concept applied to humans and their consumption. So the ecological footprint is a measure of humanity's demand on the lands and waters, and we can compare that to the biocapacity of the lands and waters, or in other words, the supply of the lands and waters' ability to sustain an ecological footprint. You've probably heard about the concept of an ecological footprint before. But I'd like to impress upon you that the ecological footprint is not just a metaphor and not just sort of an interesting personal calculator or exercise you can do in a classroom setting, but actually there is a great deal of work behind these national ecological footprint and biocapacity accounts that we do at York University that I direct in one of the many hats I wear. So the ecological footprint is the sum of various components, and I'll just profile what those are. So it's the sum of various components, including the sum of the fishing grounds, some of the built up land, accounting for all human built infrastructure and so on. It also includes our demand for cropland to grow the crops that we consume as humans or that are consumed by animals that we consume as humans. Also includes our demand for grazing land, for the grazers that we consume as humans. Ecological footprint also includes as a measure our demand for forest products, in other words, demand for the forested area that's needed to supply us with paper products, timber, fuel wood, and so on. And ecological footprint also characterizes our demand for lands to sequester carbon emissions. Now, I'm sure many of you are mindful that lands and waters can sequester carbon. You can sequester carbon through various ways, and various landscape grasslands can sequester them. Farmland even can be also used as a carbon sink, and so on. It turns out that at the current moment, forests provide the greatest sequestration per area on the planet. And so that's why in the ecological footprint accounts, we account for the amount of forest land needed to sequester carbon emissions from humans. And so by doing that, we account for the sort of minimum of land needed to sequester carbon emissions. And this is beyond the emissions that are sequestered by the oceans, which do sequester a fair portion of anthropogenic emissions every year, but of course not the total amount. And then biocapacity is the supply of forest carbon uptake of forest products can be supplied by, of course, forests. Forests can supply products or sequester carbon. They can't do both. If we're harvesting and consuming the forest, we've lost that carbon sink at that moment, according to the accounting worldwide. All these components can be summed into global hectares as a measure of hectare that is calibrated into standardized global units, so you can make comparisons between hectares in Canada, in Ontario, anywhere else on this planet. And so the advantage of doing all this is we can sum these things up and we can get a measure of how much land we demand as humans that's needed to sustain us and our consumption of things that can be regenerated or renewed within the course of a year in the realm of food and so on, and especially in the realm of carbon uptake as well. And that's really important on the path to net zero emissions because, of course, as I showed before, we can use land to soak up carbon, but that's not the only thing that we already use land for. So we have to be mindful about these other uses of land too, and put it all into a consistent accounting system to make sure that we're being as comprehensive as we can in quantifying this competition for land and how much is available and how much is in demand and that sort of thing. So with this concept of ecological footprint and biocapacity, we can apply real world data, and that's what we do at York University. And this is what it looked like in 2017. The ecological footprint of humanity in 2017 was much in excess of the biocapacity of planet Earth in 2017. In other words, we're demanding more from nature than nature can regenerate within the course of a year. This is what the metric looks like over time from 1961 to 2017. This is the ratio of the ecological footprint relative to biocapacity. And you'll note that from 1970 onward, we've been in the position of a global overshoot, where the ecological footprint is in excess of biocapacity. And so that means in every one of those years, we as humans are demanding more from lands and waters than can be sustainably provided to us. So not surprisingly, over time, carbon is accumulating and also lands are degrading. We are overusing them. We are putting more pressure and demand on the lands than can be sustained over time. And we think about the path to net zero emissions by 2050, if we imagine what this thing will look like in the future, essentially, we can quantify the ultimate goal of net zero emissions by 2050, let's say, or 2040, whatever the year threshold is, as being the goal of getting the ecological footprint down to the level of biocapacity within 1 year. And so the key question, though, is, of course, how do we get there from here? What's the path going to look like? Is it going to look like this, or the steady decline? Is it going to be a dramatic decline? Is it going to be really hard to get there, and it's going to be really hard to bring it down, and so on? And it's important to have an accounting system like this, of course, because, as I said before, the path to get there, the path to reduce the carbon component of the footprint, is going to involve potentially using or having more demands on the lands that otherwise are being used for crops and grazing and so on. So that's why it's important, I think, to have systems like this. And of course, this is done on a planetary basis, but we also do it on a national basis as well. And that's really important because, of course, countries around the world, including Canada and 120 other countries, are all embarking on that path to net zero emissions by 2050, more or less. Some countries are doing it sooner than others, but Canada has this goal of net zero emissions by 2050. And so therein lies the question of how to get there. And that's really important, especially for a country like Canada, which engages heavily in trade with the rest of the world, because it's one thing about getting us to there. But if every other country is trying to do that too at the same time, how's that going to affect, let's say, our imports and our exports and that sort of thing? So I'll just profile to Canada's ecological footprint in 2017 in global hectares. And so you can get this data for any year in that timeline for any country as well. And so in 2017, Canada's ecological footprint of all the production that took place in the country in that year was almost 450 million global hectares. That's a lot of land and water, and those are the components categorized by that. We can characterize this as the ecological footprint of production, meaning this is the amount of lands and waters needed to sustain all the productive activities that took place in Canada in that time period. It's important to be mindful that about a third of all the stuff that we produce in Canada, we actually export to the rest of the world. And about a third of all the stuff that we consume in Canada was produced in the rest of the world. And so Canada engages heavily with the rest of the world in trade, much more so than other countries like the United States, which is less trade oriented, and it consumes more of what it produces proportionally. And so it's important to have accounts like this because it can take into account these various relationships and interlinkages through trade. And so the ecological footprint of exports accounts for about half the ecological footprint of production, which is substantive because remember, a third of all the stuff that we produce in Canada is for exports. But yet half of all the ecological footprint of all the stuff we produce is accounted for by exports. So we export very footprint intensive stuff. And if you look at the ecological footprint of imports, which we calculate as well, you'll see the ecological footprint of imports is half the ecological footprint of exports. For each dollar of an export from Canada, there's twice as much ecological footprint embodied in that export as there is within each dollar of imported stuff into Canada. So Canada is still very much in that realm of sort of a hewer of wood, drawer of water, and so on, where we're sending a lot of biocapacity to the rest of the world in exchange for us importing a lot of things that are more, let's say, material or more immaterial in nature, importing information, payment for patents, software stuff, digital products, and all that sort of stuff. So with this, though, we can take the ecological footprint of production minus the ecological footprint of exports plus the ecological footprint of imports to get the ecological footprint of consumption. And of course, we also have this detailed still by component. And my research team at York also has generated the ecological footprint of consumption in Ontario, so just at a provincial level as well. And that'll be released very shortly as part of Ontario, State of Ontario's biodiversity report coming out at this within the next few weeks. So with all this, this is really important, I think, kind of accounting system that's really important to have as part of this engagement with the path to net zero emissions. So all this has me sort of reflecting as a bit of a wrap up, I guess, on what should we aim to maximize or minimize. And that kind of thinking is very much like an economist's way of thinking, where not only do we do math, but we also do math in an application where we're trying to maximize or minimize something. And that is really important because I find very much in this realm of both carbon stuff, but even the realm now of the sort of thinking about the post-COVID recovery and so on, it's not quite clear what it is that we're trying to maximize or minimize. And if we can be a bit more clear on that, then I think that certainly will help us to chart a successful path for the future. Now, you might have, I hope you have great ideas of your own of what you think we, as a group, we should aim to maximize or minimize. We might have our own individual preferences of what to maximize or minimize personally, but we should think about what we as a group should aim to maximize or minimize. Now, mindful that some of you engage at a city level and at a political level, you're probably feeling a little bit constrained where you can't think too big at the moment, especially now, given the sort of COVID situation but increasingly thinking about the post-COVID recovery and what that can look like and so on. You're probably thinking about very sort of more modest practical measures of what to maximize or minimize. Perhaps you're thinking about maximizing jobs and minimizing greenhouse gas emissions. This is on the mind of a lot of people at all levels of jurisdictions, but especially in the political realm. And this is something where, again, if we do a little bit of math, very simple math, it can be sometimes quite illuminating and often challenges a lot of preconceived notions of what is or is not very good from a jobs perspective and a greenhouse gas perspective and so on. And so that's where I would encourage any of you who are interested in this topic to engage with Statistics Canada data that has great accounting for the jobs related to different outputs from different sectors in the economy, and also the greenhouse gas emissions per each unit of output from different sectors in the economy. And I'll just profile a few examples. One, for example, if we're looking at mega project construction versus repair construction, this is on the minds of a lot of people nowadays. Some of you might be interested in this sort of issue that is turning out to be a pretty big one in Ontario about the GTA West highway construction concept. So this sort of concept of spending $6 billion or more in this mega project of this brand new highway north of the GTHA, and eating up lots of valuable and productive farmland in the process and so on, and asking questions about, are we sure that this is the best thing we could think about as some kind of a sort of a useful infrastructure for the future versus something like repair construction? Well, there you go. Just as an example, do a little bit of math on this. We look at the data from Statistics Canada. We can look at per each $1 million of the sector's output in Canada in 2016, the full-time equivalent jobs in that sector. So if for each $1 million spent on a mega project construction, there are 4 full-time equivalent jobs needed as part of that or generated versus 6.9 in repair construction. Of course, each one of those jobs has spin-off effects. Statistics Canada has great data on the spin-off effects because they to have a good accounting for all of this throughout the supply chain and so on. And you can get the full-time jobs in Canada, let's say, based on the spin-offs. So in other words, including the jobs in other sectors that are directly related to the outputs of that sector. And then there's also great statistics about the greenhouse gases emitted in Canada from $1 million worth of output from that sector. And then when you combine the two, even if you just have a very simple ratio of the tons of greenhouse gases per full-time equivalent job in Canada, there's some interesting results, which is a mega project construction. There's twice as many greenhouse gas emissions per job in that realm as in the realm of repair construction. And that's, I think, kind of useful, because if it's the case that a lot of the engagement on this is talking about, well, this is a mega projects or projects about jobs, well, other job projects or possibilities as well. And let's be mindful about what the actual jobs content is of those. We can go further, of course. You can make all kinds of comparisons in other sectors as well. Oil and gas extraction versus nursing and residential care. Now, way more tons of greenhouse gas emissions per FTE job, of course, in the oil and gas extraction rather than the more in the realm of the care economy. Same thing in the realm of auto manufacturing versus urban transit services and so on. So all of this is to say that, again, returning to this question of what should we aim to maximize or minimize, we should also think more broadly than just some of the traditional metrics that are used. Politicians and pundits, especially those that use a lot of economic jargon in their punditry, I guess, often talk about gross domestic product, maximizing this thing called gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is a measure derived by Statistics Canada that is an attempt to measure up all the production that took place that related in transactions in the market economy within the time span of typically a year that took place within Canada or within a province or even locally and so on. Various things that we produce as humans are useful, but not all the stuff that we produce is useful. And not all the things that we produce are actually bought and sold in markets. So not all those things are captured by gross domestic product. GDP or gross domestic product is not the most inspiring measure of something that society ought to maximize at this point in time in this part of the world where there's more or less quite a lot of material and energy affluence involved in all the stuff that we produce. So we should think think to more broader measures of other things to maximize. And so I'll just leave you with this as a thought. If we want to distill all this in an ecological economics vision of what it is that we should aim to maximize or minimize, I would say that we should maximize this ratio of human well-being relative to the human metabolism of ecosystems. Now and into the future. One of the ways to do this is to more specifically maximize the ratio of long lives equitably lived with a high life satisfaction divided by the ecological footprint subject to sustaining biocapacity. And that's the way I could think of distilling all this down into one sort of formula or a ratio that hopefully will connect with you. Again, I'll just note that the ecological footprint includes a carbon component, but it's not only the carbon component. And I think that's a really great sort of measure of humanity's metabolism or metabolic relationship with the lands and waters that sustain us. And so that's why I put that in the denominator. Of course, carbon is part of the ecological footprint, but it's not the whole thing. And that's why I think it's important to be mindful of all that. So that's what I wanted to share with you. I hope that was helpful. I hope it helped to clarify some concepts you might have heard about, or might have introduced you to some additional concepts you'd like to investigate some more on your own. Yeah, I would just say that I guess there's some key messages. I would encourage you to choose ecological economics for sustainability, efficiency, and equity. Be mindful that there are competing brands of economics. Be mindful that the concept of the social cost of carbon can actually be applied in the real world, and it has been applied, and that signals the great importance to us of reducing emissions, because economically it's quite costly to emit carbon pollution, even if we're not paying for it, or we're not paying for it at a price that is reflective of its social cost. It's still very important to have measures of that, as we are increasingly seeing much more internalization of those costs through carbon pricing around the world, and so on. So with all this, then I'd like to engage in some discussions about any questions or comments that you might have. And by the way, I thought I'd just leave you with this. Turns out a few months ago, I was really excited to see that my local corner store, at least one of them, they actually unplugged the slushy machine after all that. So they started off the new year that way. And then just a few weeks ago, he brought it out and he actually cleaned it. So there you go. Small little discussions can also have, meaningful impacts and so on. And sometimes it's really exciting to measure things that aren't inherently measured. And I'll just leave you with another example. It's a much more dramatic one, but here's one of a town of 84 people unplugs a pop machine and saves $9,000 a year. Cost of electricity is very high in the Northwest territories. And it wasn't until someone actually used one of the meters to see how much electricity this machine was using in relation to what service it was providing the community. They then derived the obvious conclusion that we can do better than this. It's not economically probably worth it. So with that, I'll turn it back over to, I guess, Mike and team to carry us on.
Thank you very much, Eric. That was very illuminating, especially for me, the notion of our biocapacity versus our bio expenditure, as it were. So we have a couple of questions for you that have been prepared in advance by members of our committee, our Energy and Environment Committee. So I'll turn to Emily first and give you a poser.
Hi, thanks, Eric, for your presentation. The city of Stratford declared a climate emergency last year, and hopefully council will be reviewing climate action plan this year, which will be our blueprint on how to get to net zero. Do you have any recommendations on how rural cities, smaller communities can best approach their climate action plans given our smaller population and smaller budgets?
Yeah, well, to me, sometimes the smaller size can be quite a good asset in the sense that it's a bit easier to connect people together and to enact change as opposed to sort of much larger systems. So I would say in the realm of something like a climate emergency, I think as an economist, I would suggest if you can derive certain measures that you think are important to either things that you want to maximize or minimize or things you think are important that should be part of your sort of measures of success, identify what those are, and then figure out ways to piece them together to understand how the measures might either compete against one another or might complement each other in the sense if you achieve one, is that going to lead to achievement of something else as an enabling factor, or is it going to be in competition with something else? And I think that's helpful to do because that's essentially how you can get to a very, I think, profound understanding of potential pathways and also potential pathways that might be successful versus potential pathways that might not be successful. So I would say that is certainly some ideas to come in mind, to come to mind, and to make sure that I think you've got good broad representation there, because essentially, as I'm sure you're very mindful of, that we want to make this kind of everyone's business, really, right? And that's the thing is, and I know that can be sort of hard, but then again, that can also be much easier in a smaller context where perhaps people in different roles are more empowered in that role versus in a larger sort of bureaucratic system where it's harder to figure out who influences things, who makes decisions, and so on. Yeah, so it's kind of a high-level answer to that big question, but hopefully helpful in that realm.
Thank you.
I'll next go to Jeff, who also has a prepared question, and I'll go to the questions from the audience.
Thank you, Eric, and that was especially illuminating at the end with the job, the figures of the jobs generated by the various industries. And it kind of feeds into my question, which is, what should a transitional sort of industrial strategy, one that prioritizes obviously curbing emissions and moving to renewables. In your opinion, what are the sorts of policies that an industrial strategy would include, and what in particular, how can we sort of support and advance the idea of collective well-being while making that transition?
Yeah, well, the collective well-being aspect is one where I think it's really helpful to juxtapose, let's say, the good things, the things you want more of, the well-being aspects, along with the emission reduction aspects at the same time, because it's those sort of ratios that's important. And so just thinking back to that ratio I profiled before, to the extent that we can reduce our metabolism of lands and waters, our consumption of energy and materials, our wastage of materials and energy, and so on, to the extent that we can reduce that, the better. The extent to which we can achieve more well-being and life satisfaction, quality of life, and so on, given the amount of that already, the better too. And then more of those, both those combinations at the same time, I think would be, all that more, all that better for everyone. I think in the realm of industrial strategy and so on, I think one is to appreciate that industries already now have some kind of an internal sense of, with like, if there were a price, if a carbon price emerges at something in the realm of 50 versus $100 a ton or something, they'll have some sense about what projects become more meaningful or more constrained in that. Now, that's tricky information to get in a kind of a group setting, because that's proprietary commercial information. But if you can work on processes that sort of allow some revelation of some signals about what that kind of can look like what possibilities arise at a certain level, and also what constraints arise at a certain level, I think that can be very helpful for putting things together to almost generate kind of like a possibilities curve, that depending on what the carbon price is, this is kind of what we're going to start to, this is what we'd anticipate seeing arising, not just in the realm of industrial stuff, but also in the realm, let's say, of in how, like, how lands are used, the extent to which, as I was talking about before, for food versus other biofuels and all that sort of stuff. I think that can be helpful so that there's not as much surprise, because what's going to happen, I think, in the coming decades is that we're going to see the carbon prices very quickly. Like, there's going to be a lot of activity once those prices start getting, a bit more meaningful in the realm of, like, when they start getting around $100 a ton or something like that, which might not be that far into the future. And I think the more heads up you can have in advance, the better it is to figure out the role of everybody as part of that. Whether you've got sort of interesting new industrial sort of clusters emerging, where there's coupling of one person's wastes as another person's inputs and that sort of thing. Whether it's, on the role of the government, whether it's municipally or provincially and so on, and coordinating some of that and facilitating transitions and that sort of thing. And also even just the politics of all this, to understand what's coming, what is going to be threatening, or what's not going to be as threatening as it might at first appear.
Thanks for that, Eric. There were 2 or 3 questions on the same kind of vein, so I'll try and combine them into one for you. One was just, can a social cost be translated to a per person cost? And then as a secondary, someone asked, rather than pricing carbon emissions, how about the concept of rationing carbon through an individual personal carbon budget, where we all get an equal share of the budget and reducing it each year to meet the IPCC goals, and big consumers of carbon have to buy their ration from smaller users, a bit like cap and trade, but at a personal level. So is there a way to translate the social cost to a per person cost, and would it make sense to do the cap and trade at a personal level?
Well, for the social cost, translating that to a personal level, I just want to make sure I understand the question right. If it's about, like, personally, what does it mean for each ton of emissions that I account for because of, let's say, a flight somewhere because of the heating within the course of the year of where I live and my family situation or something like that. If it's in that realm, it's quite straightforward that the social cost of carbon is a way to anchor what that is. If it's the other way around, which is like how much future damage am I personally going to experience from climate change, that's where it wouldn't be the social cost of carbon. That would be more the, I'm not sure what we'd sort of call that, but that's where I'm not, sorry, I can't engage further with the questioner to ask for clarification whether, which of those two aspects it's about. But for the other question about, you were, sorry, just remind me there, you were saying that
a personal carbon budget rather than a cap and trade at a national level than a cap and trade at a personal level.
Yeah, I think if you have a sort of a cap and trade at a personal level, that would be a lot of effort for everybody to be involved in buying and selling emissions credits. And I think it's much easier to have that be done at a more aggregate level. So it's at the level of the, let's say, the company that supplies us with natural gas, to have them engage in the cap and trade system or whatever, rather than each of us individually to engage with that. The other challenge with that too is the presumption that might have been in that question that all of us should necessarily have a fixed initial allocation of carbon. I would I'd scratch my head a little bit on that because to me it's not obvious that each of us as as individual humans necessarily based on our life circumstances, our age, all these sort of factors, it's not clear that all of us we should necessarily assume that all of us would ideally have the same emissions annually. So I wouldn't, I'm not too keen on that idea, but I think it's much better to think about at an aggregate level, the emissions of the province or the city or the nation or of the planet. I think it's much better at that aggregate level rather than the individual level.
Emily, did you have another question?
I do have a farming related question that I'd like to ask you. So farming is one of the backbones of our community. Do you have any recommendations on how farmers who are stewards of the land, but also need to run a profitable business, can participate in the shift to a green economy?
Yeah, well, the shift to a green economy involves a shift in the products and services that ought to be commercially viable. Farmers know well that not only do they provide food to humans or to other animals, but they also provide lands that can be refuges to biodiversity, wildlife, and so on. The challenge has been that if society doesn't have a mechanism to reward those who go above and beyond requirements to conserve lands, then that's obviously a commercial challenge for farmers. And so in the same way that people who live within cities would want to be paid for the efforts that they do to provide community benefits of various things, not surprisingly then it's an obvious policy proposition that the same should be offered in the realm of non-commercial services from lands and waters that are owned across the landscape. And so that's where you get into things like systems like payment for ecosystem services. And there's various ways to engage with that. I mean, there's been some organizations that have tried to articulate sort of a fixed payment per area of, let's say, area of like of conserved land that otherwise could be farmed. But there's other ways to do that that are a bit more efficient, I would say. Things like either reverse auction systems where farmers can offer, let's say, here's some land I'm willing to do such and such a thing for the good of a society in the future and so on, that is not commercially viable at present, but I'd like to do that, but it's going to take some effort on my part. It's going to take some sacrifice from what I could otherwise be earning, let's say, from commercial, land rents and that sort of thing. And then with that offer, they'd have some kind of a system so they can put that offer in, and then if someone takes them up on that offer, then there's a transaction, and it's kind of like a cap and trade system, but it's not so much sort of capping the amount of conservation, but rather it's sort of the reverse of that, where it's enabling that. So a few years ago, I was involved in a project to create this species at risk benefits exchange proposition, which would be that. Never went anywhere, but that doesn't mean it can't go anywhere in the future. And so that's something I think is really important to consider.
We had another question on the social cost of carbon that's a little tough, I think. If one values the social cost of carbon in dollars, does it not ignore the real cost in lives, misery, poverty, flooding, forest fires, refugees, et cetera, reducing it to dollars can let people think that we can just buy our way out of climate change. And I know you're coming from the position of being an economist, so it's, I think that the big numbers that were there were to take account of that, but it doesn't have a human attachment to a dollar number. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, so one thing is to clarify that the social cost of carbon includes not just those things that are bought and sold in markets, but also some of the models that generate that will include what the questioner was raising. So the lives lost, the misery, the poverty, the flooding for sure, forest fires, refugees, and so on. So it does attempt to account for that. And of course, that's challenging to account for because we don't quite know how that's going to play out, of course, but that's where we build in certain scenarios. And that's where I didn't present this as a visual because it's a little bit more of sort of a challenging image to walk through, but in the realm of social cost of carbon, the results of all those model simulations is a probability density function. It's kind of like it's showing you, like, out of all the thousands of model runs with different parameters and assumptions and uncertainties and so on, this is sort of the shape to all the possible results. And then from all those possible results, we can get confidence intervals, and we can have averages and means and that sort of thing. So that's where we can distill it down to some of those numbers that I presented in that range, but we can also look at sort of the shape of all that. And that's what's done not only in the realm of social cost of carbon, but even just in climate modeling itself. When the United Nations IPCC is figuring out what's the likely amount of emissions in the future, what's the likely accumulation in the atmosphere and so on, they have also similar models and scenarios and so on. So so that clarifies that that there is an attempt to integrate those, and that's where and as an economist, I've engaged before in project appraisals, let's say for many years ago when we were the question was whether to stop burning coal in Ontario to generate electricity. That's where we crunched the numbers, both in terms of the commercial costs of different, constructing alternatives, extending pipelines and all that sort of stuff if needed and so on. But we also accounted for things like reductions in premature mortality associated with the high particulates and nitrous oxides and other things associated with burning coal in Ontario, et cetera. And so it is possible to integrate those things that aren't bought and sold in markets, but to be mindful of them and to express them in dollar equivalents. The dollar equivalence is not saying that you can buy your way out of it. And indeed, there's no mechanism for us directly to, let's say, pay the future directly in terms of here's some food for you in the future, because I know in the future it's going to be hard to get that same food because the food provision area is going to be flooded out. The only way we can engage between now and into the future is to be much more mindful about the stuff that we build or not, the lands that we transform or not, and so on. And that's the way that we pass things off into the future. So, so yeah, I would just try to impress upon this person that when you express something in a monetary unit, doesn't mean that you can actually buy it out. It just means that it's sort of a unit of account, an equivalence. And so that's where, for example, at a municipal level, it can be very helpful. Let's say when you're thinking about, is it, let's say as part of a climate declaration of emergency, does that mean that, I don't know, let's say transit should be free or not on certain smog days or not, or year round or not? Does that mean, what does that mean for like parking rates and fees? What does that mean for stormwater fees and all that sort of stuff? All these sort of questions that emerge from that, the answers to all those involve integrating some component of, well, if we save this much on emissions, like there has to be some way to quantify that into the calculation as to whether it's a prudent thing to do at the city level, let's say. And so that's where this unit of a social cost of carbon can come in, can be very useful that way, because in the absence of some kind of a monetary unit, it's a bit hard to integrate that in, and there's a chance that it'll be marginalized, which I'm sure, you know, the question wouldn't want.
There's a couple of community questions out of the Facebook group that are very similar. How can a community prepare a carbon budget? What skills and tools do they need? And should communities create carbon footprint cost estimates for their own communities? So they're kind of related.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, me and some others have been thinking about that a lot lately. There's this organization based in the United States, the Global Footprint Network, which has done a lot of work over the years in quantifying the ecological footprint, and they've also developed an individual ecological footprint calculator. The challenge with that is it's just an individual calculator. It doesn't aggregate by either the household or the community level, the neighborhood, or the parish, or the, you know, and the list goes on. And so I think it would be really helpful, and I'm sorry there's nothing available yet, but it's something that's on our mind, to have a calculator that can be engaged with at a group level, so that the group can have shared targets, and the group can support each other in sort of discovering ways to economize on things, and also discovering ways to measure certain things too. Because a lot of this involves us being attentive to things that we aren't normally attentive to. I mean, everyone's completed their census a few weeks ago, I should hope, the Canadian census, and depending on which version of the census you got, you probably got some questions asking you, how much did you spend on electricity in the last year? Now, probably within a household, a lot of people aren't quite sure how much they actually spend on electricity or something like that. And so things like that, on how much was spent on certain things, and also how much enjoyment we might have got out of certain things or not, those are all really insightful things to think about and to discover at a family level and at a group level too, because all that stuff adds up at a group level. And so if there was some kind of a sort of a calculator or a toolkit or a workbook or something for the person who asked that question, it would be great. I'm just sorry I don't have anything to offer right now, but that's certainly something on our mind, I guess. So if you are interested in doing something like that, just I guess connect with us, and we could see maybe if there's a project proposal out of this that we could try to get some funding and some students to help put this together.
That would be extraordinary, because one of the question was, what skills would they need? You and your students obviously have those skills to do that kind of thing. So our committee will consider your comments and maybe get in touch with you about that. One of the things we have successfully, I think, done with the city of Stratford is looked at future building. Like right now, home building, we're a kind of a sprawl community where houses are built in pieces of farmland that have been swallowed up and none of them are paying very close attention to more than the code for energy efficiency. And so we've talked to the passive house people, but the laws in Ontario are such that the city is powerless to actually require home builders to do more than the code. So we're looking at ways of incentivizing, and the city has actually put that into their discussions for the 2022 budget to figure out how they can do that. This city is actually quite progressive when it comes to looking at ways to solve these problems.
Mm-hmm.
Jeff, did you have another question?
Yeah, and actually, that's you're leading me right into it, Mike. Eric, you talked a lot about sort of from a scale level what municipalities can do, but I'm wondering what Stratford is one of those municipalities that I think always likes to think of itself as a leader wherever possible, and what given the fact that as Mike said, municipalities are very constrained politically by the province and by their lack of political power. What sort of steps can we take to sort of preserve and plan for our collective biocapacity, given that we don't have that we don't have the legal or regulatory authority of the senior levels of government.
Well, there still is quite a broad range of fees and permits and authorizations and so on that cities are still involved in, right? That they still have the power to do. And I would encourage, I'm just saying this from my own perspective, engaging in that sort of stuff at the level of, or at the city of Hamilton, that there's a lot of those fees and fines and permit rules and so on are, I would say, in need of a great refresh. The prices and requirements don't align very much with sort of nowadays what's on a lot of the mind of professional planners and so on. And so I think that's where you don't have to wait for something provincially of changing direction, or saying, like the province saying, thou shalt, let's say, have stormwater fees that follow this kind of approach. I think at a city level, you can engage on the question, let's say, of for stormwater pricing, like, stormwater pricing, I don't know how it's done in Stratford. I'm sorry, I don't know, but I'll just say, let's say in the city of Hamilton, like a lot of the cities initially, you just price that based on the water that's metered. Well, the cost of stormwater is largely the amount of paved surface area and all the runoff from that overwhelms the systems and so on. If you're going to have a polluter pays principle approach applied to something like stormwater fees and pricing, that's within the realm of a municipality. Politically, sometimes it can be hard to do, but that's totally within the scope and accountability of a city. And so that's just sort of one example that comes to mind. And I would just say too, if I can just segue a little bit on what Mike was saying just before too, is that I know a lot of professional planners are very keen on also making sure that the new builds are done better and done right. But I would just encourage them to think very much also about transforming for all the existing builds. How do you get it so you internalize much more of these considerations into how things are done? And so that's where something like in the realm, let's say, of stormwater or something, it's one thing to say, well, the new houses have to have this amount of green space, this amount of trees and all that sort of stuff, but it's nothing to make it so that for everyone who's, all the properties already exist, how do you get it so that they are doing more on-site stormwater retention systems and so on? How do you incentivize them to do that? You have that, so those can be credits as part of the stormwater system, the way that the city of Waterloo did it. And if you do that, that becomes a way to sort of make it so that not just the new build people, but also the existing property managers are also being much more mindful of opportunities to conserve and so on, if you can sort of make it more of a polluter pays approach. So that's what I would offer.
I'm being reminded that we're getting close to the end here, but there are still some excellent questions. You can see those questions, can you not, Eric, in the Q&A box? And for those that haven't asked questions, that's where you put them. Right at the bottom from Emily C. Does our relatively short-term focused political system discourage leaders to actually analyze and act on the economics of climate change? How do we combat that? I've often wondered, my former leader had 2 eagle feathers given to him to remind him that whatever action he took, he should think 7 generations in the future. But political leaders only look to the next election. And so they can make all the great grandiose promises they want, but as long as they get reelected, it doesn't matter if they fulfill them because they are put off so far in the future. How do we combat that? How do we as a society create mechanisms to make our leaders accountable beyond the next election in terms of the economics of the environment?
Yeah, well, I think the more that we can internalize these environmental considerations into the economic system, the more out of necessity they shall all be more attentive to the environment and the long term. It's a challenge if you're going up against, if you're trying to propose something that there isn't a return, the sort of the economic or the city level return on something that's the right thing and the good thing to do because the bad things haven't been priced yet and so on. So that's where I think this is all about trying to integrate much more of the environment in the future into the information that we have available, into prices that are used to inform decisions, trade-offs, and all that sort of stuff. I would just also question a little bit of the sort of cynicism that assuming that people in a political realm are only short-term focused. I mean, they're just as much interested in all of us as legacy and so on. And the comment about 7 generations, it's quite possible that many of us within our lifetime might end up knowing around 6 generations of humans. So it's not that far off, right? If you think of like 3 generations prior to us, 3 generations after us, and so on. I think, I don't know, I think the responsibility falls on our shoulders a little bit, which is for us to ask important questions, for us to, if we care about these things, to take an interest, to show up, to speak out and all that sort of stuff. So I would say it's been more sort of, I guess, a little bit on our shoulders, but also to think about other things that we've successfully overcome. For example, in the realm of things like pensions and insurance and so on. I mean, none of those things, if you think about it in a very crass, self-interested, short-term perspective, you say, well, why should anyone necessarily care about things like insurance or pensions in the future and all the rest? Well, we've devised mechanisms to have it so that there are sort of organizations or groups of people that have these obligations to focus very narrowly on one kind of objective. And so we can do the same thing in the realm of the environment. There's talk about things like common asset trusts and so on. So these trustees who have that focus, just like pension trustees have a focus on pensions, or bankruptcy trustees have a focus on bankruptcy, to have these sort of common asset trustees who are focused, let's say, on, if their focus is the greenbelt, they're the ones who are sort of representing that, or whatever example you want to use. And if that's the case, I think it's much easier for there to be sort of common asset trustees focused on something much more specific, rather than having things like, I don't know, various lands and waters and green belts and all that sort of stuff all rolled up within, let's say, a provincial ministry or something like that, where it doesn't get the attention, the focus it deserves. Anyways, there's a lot of ideas in this space, and so I just encourage anyone who's interested. The ecological economics community tries to be understandable in how it communicates and how it writes about things and ideas that it has. And so you might find some interesting things if you're interested in things like common asset trusts and so on, to check that out. If you look up ecological economics online, you can connect to a great community there. And it just so happens that that in the next few days, there's the meeting of the Canadian Society for Ecological Economics, and that brings together like-minded people from across the country that are focused on all kinds of interesting things. Certainly not just on carbon stuff, but also including carbon initiatives, energy initiatives, and so on, doing some modeling, doing some scenario work, doing some sort of engagement activism work, and so on. And it's really, really interesting to learn what ecological economists offer and what they do, and the kind of solutions they offer can be quite uplifting. So I'd encourage you to check that out. The acronym is called CANSEE, C-A-N-S-E-E. So yeah, if you're interested in that, you can check that out. And then yeah, one final thing too, as you said, the time is winding down, but I'll just offer this too, that for anyone still on the line, if you're interested more in this topic, if you go to this website, elge.ca/Stratford, I will post the slides that I used tonight, and I also have a few links. I included a link to the Canadian Society for Ecological Economics and links to some other things around footprint data if you're interested in that, and so on. And then also on that page, there's a link if you want to book just a few minutes in my calendar to have a quick video chat about anything. I invite you to do that too. I know that if we were in person together, chances are that some of you maybe afterwards want to like corner me and ask me a bit about something I said or about some other idea that you have. And we can't do that obviously because we're all virtual, but I just want to make that available so that, you know, to close or reduce those distances now that we have in the online form.
Okay, well, that's excellent. We're getting our own Stratford link to your presentation. So I really appreciate that. That's wonderful. Now, you may have noticed that there's a bunch of questions I didn't get to, some of which have to do with personal footprint calculations. I'm sure you have places people can go to calculate their own and their families and their friends' ecological footprints. And you can see all the questions. I'm hoping the questions don't disappear when this is over, so we can actually send them to you. The questions have been wonderful from the group, and I really appreciate all of the things you've talked about. Some of the questions now are about the rest of the environment. So how do we look after the other parts of nature, not just ourselves, et cetera, but it's all intertwined, I know. So I want to say on behalf of Climate Momentum and the Energy and Environment Committee and the City of Stratford, who have supplied us with the facilities to do this, I can't thank you enough, Eric. You've given us several hours of your time, and I know how busy a man you are. You've got a million things on the go, and single-handedly trying to solve all the ecological economic problems of the world. Not single-handedly, you've got CANSEE to help you with that. So thank you very much. A round of applause from the group, I'm sure, and thank you very much for posting that website. I'm sure you'll be hearing from people, and hopefully I can transcribe some of these questions and get them to you, and you can send them to me and I can pass them on to the participants, or they can go to your website and ask those questions directly. Thank you very, very much. And if you have any final comments.
Yeah, thanks for this opportunity. Thanks for everyone who has an interest in this topic. Don't leave economics up to just the economists. I would say I would encourage all of you to take an interest in anything economic, to empower yourselves to understand some of the concepts and languages and assumptions and so on, so that you can be a great active participant in the great discussions and challenges coming up.
Okay, thank you very much. Apologies to those whose questions didn't get asked, but you can go and ask them yourselves on the website that Eric so graciously provided for us. Thank you very much. That's all from me. Thank you to the committee and to the clerk of the City Hall, who has come in on her vacation to do this. Thank you very much, everybody, and goodbye from me.